What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a review after 100% for Torment, Tides of Numenera. This is a CRPG like most of the games I 100%. Something I thought was cool that I didn't realize when I actually started playing this game is that it was actually made by inXile Entertainment, who recently released the Wasteland 3 CRPG. Tides of Numenera is an interesting title because A, it is the spiritual successor to Planescape Torment, which is an interesting CRPG and, frankly, one of my favorites, actually, in terms of the story. So I had some high hopes for this game going into it, so just kind of letting everyone know that bias. I've talked about Planescape Torment here and there on my channel, and while Planescape Torment is by no means a super amazing game, to be honest with you, the story of it is honestly just incredible. So this being intended as a spiritual successor to that game lent itself to my high hopes. Now, being a spiritual successor, it is much like Planescape Torment in the sense that it is primarily a narrative game that has combat, though it is hardly the focus. Most situations can be resolved in a way that avoids combat. Tides of Numenera more so than Planescape Torment, but here we are. Right off the bat, because this is primarily a narrative game, I'm going to give a bit of a plot setup, but I will not be talking about the story nearly as much as I do in other reviews after 100%, purely because this game basically is the story, right? So that's just kind of how this type of CRPG works, and me telling you the story would me basically be playing the game for you. So first things first, Tides of Numenera describes itself as science fantasy, which is pretty much true. Now, the events of this game take place on what they're calling the Ninth World. Now, this confused me at first because I went into this game mostly blind, so I didn't want to read about it, I just wanted to play it, get my own opinions, that kind of thing. However, it didn't occur to me later until I found some items that were just like regular everyday objects that I got curious and looked it up. The Ninth World isn't like some crazy planet, it's just Earth, 1 billion years later, right? So literally 1 billion years from like the year this was published, I guess, which was 2017, is when it was supposed to be set. Now basically, in this 1 billion years, scholars believe that 8 truly great ages have passed, with those races or civilizations leaving, being destroyed, or transcending into something else. But regardless, everyone pretty well agrees that they're gone in some form or another. Now, because all this has happened on Earth, and it's been 1 billion years, basically every single piece of the Earth left has some sort of detritus from these previous civilizations. Your wildest dreams couldn't come up with the technologies some of these people have imagined, dreamed up, or anything else you want to call it. To the point where picking up a handful of soil will essentially have your hands full of technology from previous worlds, as they like to call them, despite it being the same world, Earth. Now, the current world, the Ninth World, is fairly medieval in a lot of ways, despite the high technology, high science stuff. Essentially, so much time has passed that a lot of people can find this technology of previous civilizations, but they have no idea how to use any of it. So as one of the companions of the game describes it, if you find a jetpack, even if it attaches and goes to something else bigger, you're not going to have the knowledge of how to put that together. So your best bet is to just use it for its face value. Which brings me to what they call those technologies. They call them Numenera, which is of course where we get part of the game name from. So all the relic technology from ages past is known as Numenera. It's largely broken up into a few different categories. There's the oddities, which are basically just junk items you can sell. They're interesting, but they don't really do anything useful. There are ciphers, which are single-use Numenera, kind of like what I described with the rocket, in that you can use them once. They have a useful function, standalone function. It was usually a piece of a greater technology at some point, but nowadays you can really only use it the one time for its one purpose, and then that's pretty much it. And then there's things like artifacts, which are more than one use technologies, but again, largely the same thing. They're clearly a piece to something bigger, but for the most part, you're just going to use them for their face value. However, they won't deteriorate after a single use. Now, while all those civilizations of the past have truly gone away, they have left, in addition to all this relic technology everywhere, something called the data sphere. From what I can gather, is essentially like an incredibly advanced cloud network that just kind of like hangs around the Earth now of its own volition, and people can access it and do certain things. So it's kind of like the internet, but minus most human interaction, because again, this is like basically medieval society we're talking about, with people living in like small villages here and there. But just kind of sharing some of the things I personally found interesting about the world. Now that brings me to another piece of the Tides of Numenera world, and that is the tides part of the Tides of Numenera. What are the tides? Tides are this sort of psychic force that some people are able to take advantage of. However, most people can't even perceive what these psychic forces are. So the people that can use them are basically able to manipulate people in various ways, or any kind of living object in a variety of ways. It can manifest itself in many, many different ways that we see throughout the game. And often they are connected to a person's emotions and personality. Now that we kind of get an idea of what the world of Tides of Numenera is all about, let's talk about your character. So building a character in this game is cool, but functionally mostly useless. So here's the thing, again, combat is not the focus of this game. You can legitimately play this game with like less than 10 total encounters, easily. Most situations are resolved with non-combat skills, which I would say are genuinely the only important part of character creation. There's a lot of different ones that help out in various situations, but I would say the most important ones are like quick fingers, anamnesis, which only your main character can learn, which is essentially like accessing memories of the past, perception, and persuasion, because you're going to be talking to people a lot, because as a narrative game, it's very dialogue focused. And moreover, despite you making a character, your character is actually a set person, so there is no like appearance thing or anything to it. Your character is what they call the last Castoff. So this is really the only part of the story I'm going to talk about. And that is essentially, you start the game by being born falling to the earth. So you are what they call a Castoff, which is to say you are a body that was used by a guy called the Changing God. So at some point during all of these lost civilizations and everything, some guy called the Changing God discovers a way to transfer his consciousness from body to body. So he starts doing so. And at this point, he's able to essentially make the bodies he plans on transferring to. However, when he leaves a body, it doesn't just become a lifeless husk. The second he leaves a body, it births a consciousness into the brain. So, as it turns out, and this is honestly explained fairly early in the game, that the bit of consciousness that is birthed into this body is actually a tiny piece of the Changing God's personality. He himself doesn't lose that, but it's like a particular facet of who he is. And because at this point in the game he's making these bodies himself before he jumps into them to begin with, they are all very easily identified by a mark, which is actually the big symbol for the game, and it's like a giant tattoo on the right side of their face. And while it's never explained exactly what this is or how it works, it's very clearly important to the process of him changing bodies. But that said, apparently the Changing God isn't super happy with having, his consciousness creating more people, essentially. So oftentimes he'll leave these bodies where they might die. Sounds all well and good until you remember that, again, he's making these bodies to jump into. So more often than not, they are basically superhuman. Strength, regeneration, all that kind of stuff. So oftentimes, despite the circumstances in which they're born, they survive anyway because of the very properties those bodies have that he needs them to have. But suffice to say, they get better with each iteration, that is the physical body he's using. So each Castoff is essentially better than the last, at least physically. And you're the most recent one. And that's kind of where you start the game. You are the byproduct of a god in a lot of ways, or at least as a lot of people see him, as a god. I mean, to be clear, this is just a smart guy who figured out how to transfer his consciousness. Outside of being intelligent, that's about the only remarkable thing about the Changing God. And that's pretty much all I'm going to say about the story. Now, the main story, while it of course does have some nuance, is largely set in stone. Like, these same events are going to happen regardless, right? However, in the side content, there's tons of options that will then affect the end slides at the end of the game. Like, a lot more than you'd think. Like, some of the one-off stuff you do in these areas actually comes up in the end slides, so good for them for including that stuff. So let's talk about the world building. Now again, this is a very dialogue heavy game, so you're going to find yourself talking to people all the time. Most people have something to say. If they've got a name, they have tons of things to say to you. They're usually involved in the quests, which is part of the world building because almost every named NPC has interactions. In fact, some of them will tell you about people that you'll meet way later in the game, and you're like, oh crap, this is the person that other person was talking about. So to their credit, there really aren't any loose threads that I personally found. Like, everything wraps up real nicely. But moreover, none of these people feel superfluous. Every one of them has a point because of the way they chose to approach that. And truly, outside of the story itself, the world building is the best part. And you know, honestly, it better be, considering the context of this being a narrative game with very little combat. But the locations are very unique. They really leaned into the science fantasy part of this. There's a lot of really cool stuff to see. Credit where it's due, that's really awesome. Now, the combat itself, because I do want to talk about the combat despite it not being the focus, is that because it's not the focus, it of course feels a little clunky. Like, it's not bad. I've played worse for sure. But it is a turn-based game. It uses a movement and an action system, kind of like D&D, where you'll be able to move and take an action in a turn. It's a little limiting, though. There's not much you can do with the combat system simply because of the way the game is designed. And again, combat's not the focus, so this is less of a ding for the game because of that. So it's like, it's easy to criticize parts of the combat, but again, you can beat this game with like less than 10 combat encounters. So it's not like it's coming up often. But to that end, when you are in combat, it's like I'm not even that concerned about it because thing about the Castoffs, they're very hard to actually kill. More often than not, if you mortally wound one, its regeneration is just going to allow it to get back up at some point. You might put it down and out for a while, but eventually it's going to regenerate, which is the plot point they use to allow your character to just resurrect. Now, there are a few points in the game where if your character dies, like, that's just it. It gives you a game over and you have to reload the save. However, because of this mechanic, most combat encounters are easily dealt with, to the point where I'd say you'd almost have to be intentionally doing something wrong or trying to fight your way through a situation that's just easier to talk your way out of. So there's like maybe 2 or 3 combat encounters I would say it'll let you get yourself into, but there's really no point in doing so, if that makes sense. Now, however, that said, there's like 2 or 3 combat encounters specifically that are incredibly difficult if you choose to get yourself into. You can get yourself into a lot of encounters if you want. However, it's almost always the worst option with the least amount of reward. So, just something to keep in mind there. So, let's talk companions. Now, much like Planescape Torment, the companions are an essential part of this game, because you are gathering up these people around you. Now, this is where the game kind of gets interesting, because you got to put these pieces together yourself. This isn't something the game is going to tell you, and at least not until the very end. But I don't want to spoil the specific reasons behind everything. What I'm about to tell you is a very common theme for Planescape Torment, and as this is a spiritual successor, I do want to mention the theme of this. All of the companions that you gather are tormented by something, as the name of the game might imply. However, as you dig deeper into it, you, through your actions and the changing god actions, are usually the reason for these people's torment. Sometimes, even if you have good intentions, you are drastically affecting everyone's life, and in many ways it's not for the better even when it tries to be. Which sounds like a simple enough concept, but if you've ever played Planescape Torment, it gets much more nuanced than that. With that said, obviously I liked most of the companions. They each have their own quest going on that has multiple endings, some very early in the game even, and then some much later on. So there is Rin, who is a child, actually, who is a slave when you find her. There is Alagurn. He is what they call an Aeon Priest, that is to say someone who made a major technological discovery for the current times. There is Tiber, who is like a roguish captain. There is Eratus, who is a very gung-ho young man for reasons you learn about through his story. There is Calistige. She is an intellectual who is trying to ascend her consciousness into the data sphere, like that's been her life's goal. And she has an implant in her brain that lets her live in many realities all at the same time, which is really weird, but I like it. Then you have Matkina. Matkina is especially cool because she's known as the White Death. She is an assassin, but moreover, she's another Castoff. You will meet tons of the other Castoffs that the Changing God has created throughout the however long this dude's been alive. But I think that's going to wrap it up. Is it worth the money? Yeah, absolutely. It is $40 on Steam normally, I believe. If you're into CRPGs and the idea of combat not being the focus appeals to you, this is a very good game with a very cool story to tell. It's relatively short. It only took me 15 hours on a first playthrough to do like as much as I could possibly find. And then subsequent playthroughs took probably 20 to 30 hours to get the rest of the 100%, which I especially enjoyed in this because it led to a lot of different outcomes that I wouldn't have even thought about on my own. So it was really cool to go back and get some of those achievements. And while most of the time I would not recommend people 100% games if they're just not super invested, this one I actually would, just because those achievements will lead you to some really interesting encounters that you might otherwise miss. But again, should you buy it? I mean, ultimately that decision's up to you. I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I do think it's worth the money because it's a pretty cool game. With that out of the way, guys, if you'd like to support the channel and help create more content in the future, I recommend you check out my merch store. I'll put a link in the description down below. Any support is greatly appreciated, especially if you're just watching the video and subscribing. So don't forget to leave a like, comment, subscribe, all that stuff. I truly do appreciate you guys watching this. It does mean a lot to me. Literally couldn't be here without you. So, thank you so much. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.